Hello, and welcome to this week's Tea Time with the Jackson Center. With me today is Dr. Kurt Graham, the director of the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and Museum. Kurt, welcome.
Great, thank you. Good to be with you.
So Kurt, you and I first met actually about this time last year. I think it was only a couple weeks into my new role when you were kind enough to come to both Buffalo and the Jackson Center to chat about Harry Truman and his legacy. And we certainly spent some time combing over some of the relationship with Truman and Jackson. But I think that that's a good place probably to start for our viewers today. So let's, as I mentioned last week to our viewers, May 2nd is a big day in our world, in the Jackson Center's world, because that was the day that officially Justice Jackson became appointed as the chief U.S. prosecutor. And I don't think people realize how many decisions President Truman had to make so early on in his tenure.
Yeah. No, it's an incredible time, and he hit the ground running. Things just moved so fast. But I want to, just before we jump into the content, just thank you again for having me here for your tea. I have my Yellowstone mug. Make sure everybody knows. But no, it's terrific to be here and get to discuss. And of course, this venue is wonderful for our viewers and followers on various social media platforms. We got acquainted, as you know, about a year ago through our mutual friend, Don Wortman, and around the notion of not just collaboration between our two institutions, but we have some artwork in common. Well-known artist there in your neck of the woods, Dexter Benedict, who's done some amazing pieces, has done a bust of Robert Jackson and a full statue of Jackson at the Jackson Center. We do have a bust, thanks to Dexter and thanks to the Wortmans, of Justice Jackson that we have displayed at the Truman Library, and very, very proud of that. It's a very important relationship and a very important moment in the history of Truman's contribution, I think, to the presidency and to the world. So I appreciate that. I think of Don and Dexter and Chris and everybody, and it's wonderful to see us able to do some of these things together. You know, when Harry Truman became president in April of 1945, it was April 12th, he'd only been vice president for 82 days. So it's not exactly like he had a lot of time to be mentored and sort of brought on board. In fact, quite the opposite. He only met with FDR twice privately. So he was not necessarily ready to take over in the sense that he had been, sort of groomed for that. However, he sure hit the ground running. And I recognized the other day when we did a piece, several videos like this for our first week, Truman's first week in office, with the president's grandson, Clifton Truman Daniel. And it was very interesting because one of the pieces I did was on Truman's first address to Congress, about 3 or 4 days in. And in reviewing that, it struck me that one of the first things that he said to the Congress as the new president of the United States was to call out the war criminals and to say, these crimes will not go unpunished. We will find out, we will get to the bottom of this. We will hold these people responsible. And of course, that was, I think it was the 15th of April. And as you know, by May 2nd, Justice Jackson is in the picture and agrees to go and perform an incredible work that took much longer than anyone anticipated. But nevertheless, this was something that was very important to Harry Truman, very important to Justice Jackson. And I think they sort of bonded around. They had their differences about other issues for sure, but I think they really had a definite, they saw eye to eye on this and saw the importance of this, to the point that Justice Jackson was willing to give up a whole year from his time on the court, the Supreme Court, to be able to carry out this mission from the President of the United States.
Yep. I think looking back, so this week really is sort of the week of deliberations, because the outreach happened, I think technically 75 years ago yesterday. And so, I guess actually it was the 26th. And then so Justice Jackson is deliberating this week. He gave President Truman, I believe, his official word acceptance yesterday on the 29th. And then the public announcement was made a few days later, which in our world will be this Saturday. And it's just, it's amazing to think sort of what must have been going through each of their minds at that time. So, Justice Jackson and probably President Truman as well didn't really anticipate that the trial would take about 15 months once that ball got rolling. I recall reading some things that they really thought probably by the end of the summer, initially anyway, that something could have been pulled together. And certainly Justice Jackson had some conversations about whether or not he was even able to do this as a justice. Was there some sort of conflict with his service on the Supreme Court? I think more in terms of stepping away and leaving that burden on his colleagues for that time span. Yeah. But it's I think you're right that there's similar outlook on how this needed to be a real trial. Mm-hmm. And how this needed to be something that moved forward in a very public, very open way that people could understand the process. Is part of what aligned them at this.
Well, and it's interesting too to consider, think about that for a minute, how unusual a setup and circumstance this was for the President of the United States to go to a justice on the Supreme Court and say, listen, I've got an assignment. I need somebody to go do something for the United States abroad. It's unusual. It's never been done before. Now presidents had done this. The one other example I can think of is John Jay in the 1790s when George Washington sent him to London, the Jay Treaty, which, had its supporters and detractors alike, but nevertheless for a sitting justice, the Chief Justice in this case, to go represent the United States on a kind of almost diplomatic mission, similar to what Justice Jackson did. And I don't know, there may be other examples. I can't think of any off the top of my head. How unusual would it be today for the president to say, look, John Roberts, I need you to go to France, or I need you to go to Africa or somewhere and undergo take on a mission. We would normally think of the Secretary of State or Defense or someone else doing that. We wouldn't think of the president reaching outside the executive branch into the judicial branch and sort of putting an assignment on someone's shoulders in that way. But I think it says a lot about the respect that Truman had for the judiciary in general, for Jackson in particular. And then Jackson's response, I think, indicates a lot about who he was, that he was willing to say, well, look, the president has called, the president has asked. I don't know what went through Jackson's mind those 2 or 3 days that he was mulling that over, but obviously he made what I think history records as the right decision.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we in doing some research and talking to our Jackson scholar Professor Barrett, certainly some deliberations of what this might mean for him politically and on the court. Obviously, the time away from his family and from the court itself. Justice Jackson seemed to have been keen to serve in some capacity during World War II. He had actually offered to resign a few times from the court in order to help the administration in another area. And each time at that point, President Roosevelt had said, no, I need you where you are. That is where you will be of most valuable service. And so I really do think he saw this as his way to contribute to the war effort.
But isn't that amazing to think that, you think today about how people prepare their whole careers. From the time they're in law school, they are groomed to become a federal judge and to ultimately, in their wildest dreams, hope upon hope that the stars align and they get to be on the court. Can you imagine anyone today willingly saying, look, I will walk away from this to serve the country if there's another role that I need to play? Mm-hmm. I just think that's incredible. I think, Harry Truman was that way. He wanted to quit the Senate and go to World War II, and he was, as one of the generals told him, you're too damned old, and he didn't have that option. But he would have done it. He would have left the United States Senate just like Jackson would have left the court. I think that is just a level of statesmanship that we can't even relate to. I think that's just a level of patriotism and service and ethic and, whatever. You can come up with all kinds of adjectives, but I just think that it's a lost art, a lost feeling in many ways, and lamentably, but that's why I think we hearken back to these guys, because there are elements of greatness that we do recognize, and no matter what side of the aisle we're on today, I think we can recognize that those traits are worth having.
Absolutely. Part of what I wonder about, at least that similar outlook in their patriotism and their ability and willingness to serve, might also stem a little bit from some of their similarities in background as well. So, sort of slightly more rural, certainly salt of the earth kind of people, came up through various levels in a fairly organic and proceeding way. And it just kind of gave them that same sense of grounding.
Yeah, and it was certainly not a foregone conclusion for either one of them that they would end up in the lofty positions where they ultimately landed. And I think that is telling as well. I don't think they planned to be what they were from the time they were 17 years old, the way a lot of people plan those things today.
Yep.
But I think, back to your question about kind of these weeks and kind of where they were both coming from. I mean, I think it's really interesting, in thinking about Truman and what he thought about this. And I'd love your similar take on Jackson in this way. I mean, for him, this Nuremberg effort was so absolutely important. This wasn't just this will look good in the eyes of the world, or this is it's kind of an ethical, moral thing to do. I mean, for him, this mattered, and it mattered deeply. As I said, he calls this out in his first address to Congress just 4 days into his presidency. So clearly it's been on his mind. This isn't a new kind of off the cuff talking point that somebody slipped into the speech somewhere for him. But he had this notion, and he said years later, after he had long retired, and he was interviewed, and he said he was so proud of this process, this international tribunal that had been set up in Nuremberg. I think he probably would have claimed it as one of his, greatest accomplishments. But he said he was so proud of that, and particularly the work of Justice Jackson in that. But he said, never again will men be able to say, I was just following orders.
Yep.
That the slaughter of innocent people, I mean, war is war and war is hell. And Harry Truman knew that like nobody else. There were 4 American presidents served in World War I. Only one of them saw combat, and that was Harry Truman. And Truman knew what it was like to be shot at. He knew what it was like to have guns and, cannon fire going off all around you. And what stuck with me was his notion that the complainant in this case at Nuremberg, that Jackson was going to go now prosecute, the complainant was the conscience of mankind. So it wasn't, the US versus, it wasn't, the European nations versus, it was the conscience of mankind will make a claim in this court. And I don't know how to express it any better, but it just amazes me to think how important something like the consciousness of mankind, and the conscience of mankind, I should say, for people like Truman and Jackson. I mean, they were motivated by such a deeper, higher call that it's just kind of stunning to sit back and think about that.
Yeah, and that really seemed to be one of the sticking points, certainly for Justice Jackson during the negotiation of the London Charter and Agreement, because he was very keen on the idea that the concept of aggressive war needed to be in that document, because that needed to be one of the crimes that that they could be charged with. And in his mind, it was because he wanted to try to make the waging of war as illegal as possible.
Right.
And part of that is, obviously the natural deterrent, but, that was one of his biggest points, was we need to figure out a way to make this illegal, but also as part of that, because he basically said, if you cannot be prosecuted for following orders, and the people giving the orders can't be prosecuted because they didn't actually commit the atrocities,
right,
then you, in essence, have a world in where nobody can be prosecuted for anything with regard to war.
Right. Well, and I think that is the brilliance of what the sort of Truman-Jackson, call it the 1-2 punch or whatever here, is about. And that is, how liability works in the legal. I mean, everybody's like, well, no, I'm not responsible for this. I only did it because this, and I only did it because of that. Well, for Truman, it was very important that both those who gave the orders and those who carried out the orders were equally culpable. And there is no way to say, oh, well, it's war. He had to, the general, he had to make the call. And it's one thing to call out military targets. It's another thing to, move your troops in a certain way and to try and take an army out. I mean, that is war. But when we're talking about Nazis here, we're talking about 9 million people who were killed over the course of those many years. And this was not collateral casualties of a war effort. I mean, this was a systematic annihilation. This was genocide. This was there's no spin to put on this. And I think it was just really, again, incredible that Truman and Jackson came to that conclusion that no, we will go after those who gave those orders, those who carried them out. It's all the same, because they knew it was wrong. They knew what they were doing was wrong. And again, the conscience of mankind comes into play here, because any human being should be able to determine whether that was right or wrong. You don't need, that didn't have to be specifically legislated against or whatever. That's a high enough law that it shouldn't have to be written down in anybody's.
No external force necessary there.
No codification necessary here for that. Yeah, exactly.
Yep. And, something I'm not sure people realize is that certainly while President Truman and Justice Jackson thought it best to move forward with the Allies, move forward as a group, they were also perfectly prepared to move forward on their own if they weren't able to get the other 3 allies to come to an agreement on that. And so even that just speaks to how deep their commitment was to, this is the correct path forward. Mm-hmm. And while, yes, it would be best if we move forward as a united front, we're moving forward this way almost regardless of whether or not you come with us.
Yeah. It's interesting, because that very strain of thought, that line of thinking that you just alluded to, is very tied to Truman. I mean, I mentioned the first speech, and how he calls out the war criminals. In that same week, they come to him and say, Mr. President, what about this United Nations thing that Roosevelt had set up? We got this thing out in San Francisco. Do we cancel that? Do we pull out? Do we go forward? And Truman said, no, keep it on the calendar. I'm going. And he went out there and spoke and basically launched the United Nations. I mean, granted, it was Roosevelt had all that in place, but for Truman, I have to believe this was a kind of, he loved Woodrow Wilson and the whole notion of the League of Nations and whatnot that came out of World War I. And Truman had a very international perspective, for a Missouri farmer, for some guy who just came out of the sticks. I mean, he had a remarkably global perspective. And really, you can say the birth of globalism, as we understand it, came out of that era. And again, I give credit to Franklin Roosevelt for much of it as well. But, as we sort of question globalism today and wonder, do we just pull back? Is isolationism the way to go? Isolationism was the Republican Party of those days, people like Senator Robert Taft and, prominent people like Charles Lindbergh and Vandenberg and others like that were more in that isolationist camp. And Truman, they were the outreach. They were the sort of global party, I guess you'd say, at that time. And things change in our parties over time, and there's a whole big question going on, I think, in both the parties now about what is the proper role of the United States. I don't think Harry Truman ever stopped to question that. I think he felt that we had a role to play. And that role was to bring as much peace and prosperity to as many people as we could. And it wasn't about pulling all of our, taking all of our marbles and going home and just playing in our own sandbox. It was, it was the Marshall Plan. It was rebuilding, not just allies, but former foes. Mm-hmm. It was rebuilding nations, and it was, prosecuting the criminals that had brought this on everyone. I think it's worth remembering that, this too had to be invented. This notion of America having a major role to play on the world stage was not something that just sort of fell to the nation. It was something that the nation conscientiously carved out for itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's, I think that certainly since the generations have passed, we have just become so used to that being the norm that that you don't think about where did this actually start from, because certainly that was not part of the makeup of the country from the beginning. And needed to be a position that they reached for and assumed. And
yeah. Well, and certainly, I mean, in our lifetimes, I mean, I'm older than you are, but nevertheless, from what we can remember, there's never been a question about America's role in the world. I mean, we've always been the superpower. And even though there's been, whatever, we don't want to get off on all of that, but I mean, other nations, and we talked today about the rise of China and what is Russia's role and all these kinds of things, and who knows where it all goes. But the fact of the matter is, certainly since long before we were born, America has had that role. And I think it's because of the work of Harry Truman and efforts of, the steps he took with Justice Jackson and others to kind of establish that role. Yep. Other nations were not leading that charge. They said, just keep it as a political issue. And Truman said, no, this is a legal issue and a moral issue, and it needs to be handled accordingly.
Absolutely. Well, and speaking of leadership, I think I've heard you say before that you and really the entire staff of the Truman Library assume that people know two things, and two things only when they come to the museum for the first time. And that is the buck stops here, and that President Truman was the person who dropped the bombs in Japan. And so why don't we talk a little bit about some of his leadership qualities? The buck stops here is a very, very clear line in the sand of I'm in charge, and good or bad, that ends here. And so, I'm curious as to.
Well, that's a great thing to mention. Truman was very collaborative. I mean, he wasn't just a heavy hand that said, hey, my way or the highway. I mean, he got a lot of input from a lot of different people, but when it came time to make a decision, he didn't pawn it off on some committee or some other group. I mean, so the thing that stands out to me, a couple of things about Truman is he just by the virtue of when he came into office, he had to confront a number of very, very critical decisions. And, whether he made those decisions appropriately or not is a matter for historians and others to debate, for here on out. But the thing that strikes me about Truman's decisions, he didn't just make a bunch of decisions, he was decisive. And that's a different quality. A lot of people confront a lot of decisions. And one of the reasons I think that Truman is so interesting, and I try to tell people, as my way of saying it is that, those of us in the Truman business always think in terms of what is the application of the sort of lessons or what you learn or what you see in Truman's life, because, you and I don't make decisions for the world or for the country or whatever, but we all make decisions in our lives, right? We all have to confront decisions. And within the context of our own lives, they're big decisions, career decisions, family decisions, just educational decisions. I mean, we all confront big decisions. And so I love studying Harry Truman because he understood how to make decisions. He gathered all of his information. He thought it through, made the decision, and then slept like a baby.
Yep.
I mean, he did not second guess himself. He didn't beat himself up. And even over decisions like the bomb and other things, people know those kinds of things about him. But the reality is, that's 4 months in.
Yep.
He's only been president 4 months when those bombs drop and when the war is over. And he's got 7.5 years of being president ahead of him. And in those 7.5 years, he faced what I think in his mind, I think I'm fairly representing him here, were far more difficult decisions. The decision to drop the bomb was not necessarily, it was a momentous decision, and it was one he took very seriously. But the real scandal, the real controversy would have been if he had not dropped the bombs. Right. What president, given a new weapon, a chance to end a war and not have an invasion of your own army having to go in, the troops going in and who knows how many dying. That would have been the controversy. That would have been the crazy decision to make or to allow to be made. So I think Truman was, in all of the decisions that he made subsequently, what stands out to me is not just that he was decisive, but that he always returned to what I call, for lack of a better phrase, just a moral core. He did the right thing for the right reason, at least in his own mind. And again, we can always say, well, was he right? Was he wrong? And that's fair to second guess, for historians and others to go back. But I get a little put off with people who want to argue counterfactually and say, well, if he hadn't done this, if he hadn't done X, then Y would have happened. It's like, no, that you don't get that luxury. You can you can second guess things, but you can't go back and say that something would have happened a certain way, because we don't know that. We'll never know that.
Right.
What would have happened if he hadn't dropped the bombs? Well, I mean, at the time they thought there would be a lot of loss of life, both in Japan and among Americans, but we don't know what would have happened. Maybe the Russians would have gotten involved and done something that would have brought Japanese around. I mean, there are just way too many complex variables to try and second guess. But I do think that the fact that Truman returned to his center, he returned to what he believed, what he thought was right, and it was just such, to me, his life is such an incredible display of integrity, and just, you just do the right thing because that's the way you were raised, and that's what, that's what mom and God and apple pie and everything mean. And that's how he saw it, and it was and yet he was a man remarkably ahead of his contemporaries in terms of his thinking on things like race relations, international policy. I always say around here in Kansas City that this, the world is a different place because this farmer from Missouri became president. I mean, literally, the lines on the map are different than what they would have been had Harry Truman not ascended to the highest office in the land. Yeah, and I think when we work in this legacy business like you and I do, it's interesting and it's kind of fun to think about that. What would the world be if our guys hadn't come into the realm that they did when they did?
Yeah, I mean, that's an incredible statement to think through it in quite that level of clarity. That's a very specific thing for people to be able to grasp, that Europe wouldn't look the way it looks, and other areas wouldn't without him having been president.
Yeah.
So Justice Jackson, I would also consider a decisive person. He really loved words. And so in crafting his opinions, we have a lot of examples of him writing and rewriting a lot, because he really wanted to try and make sure that the wording was perfect. But the concepts themselves were usually, I don't necessarily mean fairly static, because that seems like it's as if he was closed-minded, but he made his decisions and then was really trying to shape the expression of those decisions so the most people could understand where he was coming from and where he was trying to go. And that's something I've always appreciated about Justice Jackson, is that his clarity of thought and writing generally is just pretty phenomenal.
Yeah. And I admire that quality too, because, you and I live in a world where, there are a lot of academics and a lot of people who can say things in a way, and they have really great thoughts, but the way they're communicated is not necessarily meant to be accessible. I mean, it's almost meant to be exclusive sometimes, which I find, irritating, but the reality is those people, like Truman, like Jackson. Now Jackson, unlike Truman, was educated, college and law and whatnot beyond. Truman wanted to do those things and just wasn't able to. I mean, he couldn't afford it. And although I always say he was better read than most of the professors of the day. I mean, he was well versed in world history and American history and whatnot. But I think that ability, and that's a rare quality even in a statesman today. You can think there's a handful of people who think enough for themselves that the depth of their thinking is very sincere because it's a part of who they are. But there's a clarity and kind of like a piercing quality to the way they can deliver the message. And those people are few and far between. Mm-hmm. You either get the kind of Ivy Tower academic who really doesn't reach the masses, or you get people who reach the masses kind of through maybe populism or some other way that really doesn't have the force of the thought behind it. The idea that somebody could bring deep thoughts, clarity of language, and an appropriately crafted message forward to a public that then receives it as it was intended, that is a gift. And that's interesting that you call Jackson out in that way, that because most you would not necessarily say that about most Supreme Court justices in U.S. history.
Well, and actually their education backgrounds are not all that dissimilar. So Justice Jackson did not go to college. He from high school graduation, he actually did an extra year of high school in Jamestown at a slightly larger high school than where he lived in Frewsburg. And then he apprenticed with a family relative who was a lawyer. He did spend a year in law school, because you didn't have to go to college to go to law school in those days. But it was just that year of study at the University of Albany Law School. And then he came back to Jamestown to continue his apprenticeship and start practicing. But he had a high school English teacher who really fostered in him this love of reading. And we have the list of books that she suggested that he read. And I want to say that there are a couple hundred books or plays on there, but that was part of the depth of his. She really wanted to make sure, it's everything from Shakespeare plays to the philosophers to some contemporary books that she was recommending. And so really wanted to make sure he had that breadth of thinking as well as creative expression. And so I think that that's also a lot of what helped shape his ability to communicate. And it sounds like President Truman, similarly a voracious reader, had probably that same sort of education.
Yeah, no, he did. And from a very young age, he was very nearsighted, so he couldn't go out and, he didn't play sports because he wore glasses, and that was kind of a handicap really for him in those days. And so he read and he played the piano, so he was a very cultured kind of person in that way, despite, his maybe less than cultured upbringing in other ways. No, that is interesting to think about how important being in that conversation, the classics, going back, and most of us, even who are educated today at some level, whatever that even means, are not versed in the kinds of things that Truman and Jackson were versed in. I mean, that too is a lost art, and it's lamentable because the thoughts and the feelings and the expressions that some of the great writers of all time have expressed are largely lost to us now, and we think in terms of sound bites, not in terms of deep thoughts. And so, no, I think of that founding generation. I think of John Adams and his son John Quincy, and he had taken quite an interest in John Quincy's education, the older Adams, and it came to his attention at some point that his son, who was about 15 at the time, had not yet read the Peloponnesian War. And he was just shocked. He was just, son, the clock is ticking. This is some of the greatest dialogue on democracy in history, Thucydides. How can you not be aware of this? And he was just panicked that John Quincy didn't know. And I used to say to college students, like, how many of you can pronounce Thucydides? Much less be, and yet John Adams had a very legitimate concern that young John Quincy was falling behind, or wasn't, it wasn't like at a contest, but he just wasn't maximizing his educational opportunity by not being aware of something so central as the Peloponnesian War.
Yeah, again, that grounding, that centralness.
Oh yeah. Well, and the tie to that I was going to make quickly is President Truman's grandson, Clifton Truman Daniel, lives in Chicago. He's the oldest grandson. When he was a little boy, this was after Truman was in the White House. Margaret and her husband, E. Clifton Daniel, lived in New York City, and in a high rise and whatever, and walk up, whatever it was, but it was on the Upper East Side. And so the Trumans would go to visit. And one morning, Clifton and his younger brother, he's 4 or 5 years old, they're tiptoeing down the stairs on Saturday morning on their way to watch Saturday morning cartoons. And Grandpa says, "What are you guys doing?" "Watching cartoons." And said, "No, you're not. Come here." So he sits him down, and they're cross-legged on the floor listening to him read a book. And it wasn't until later that he realized that the book was the Peloponnesian Wars. That he was reading, that Grandpa Truman was reading, exposing his own grandsons to this great literature. So it was something that really was internal to Truman, this notion of being educated and being, self-taught in every way. But
have to imagine that was a very interesting story for, two young boys just
the
war, and you could sort of see I can see how that would grab them.
Exactly.
So we are approaching the time when we like to open up for questions. But I guess I'll ask one more question of you before we get to that part. So we had talked about his collaborative nature. do you think that there was a particular collaboration that he worked with of which he was most proud during his tenure as president? Was it the United Nations? Was it something else?
I think Truman was very close to the people that worked around him. I mean, he was a genuine people person, and he enjoyed the sort of fraternal order. I mean, he was a Mason. He was very we would call him a joiner today. He joined. I think he would have joined if it was fashionable to do. He would have joined every church he ever stepped foot in. I just think he felt that it was, this is how you build a sense of community. You join these organizations. So I think he was just by nature collaborative in the sense that he was always working with other people in that way. I think some of the hardest decisions he faced, things like Korea, he made some very risky decisions in the summer of 48, leading into what became the whistle stop campaign. His re-election. He desegregated the troops, the armed forces and the federal workforce, had recognized the state of Israel early that spring. I mean, both of those decisions to me stand out as just politically risky. I mean, he could have alienated enough people to have lost his re-election bid. And I don't think anybody today would take a chance on something like that. Roll the dice, 3 months. Now, elections didn't last 2.5 years like they do today. They were 2.5 months. But nevertheless, I think he took some gambles. And so in those decisions, I don't know, I mean, he had definitely some friends and people that he was very close to. He certainly admired General Marshall. George Marshall was probably one of the people he admired the most in his career and in his time there. Lots of other, Clark Clifford, a lot of other people as well that he was close to and valued their opinion. I'll tell you, back to the United Nations, I think one of the people, ironically, that he really felt the strongest about was Eleanor Roosevelt. He had appointed Mrs. Roosevelt to serve there and had a great respect for her. I think she had a respect for him as well. Although she was, I think, conscious of not wanting to overshadow him. The fact is, when he first takes over, 82 days prior, he was still a senator, and a relatively obscure Midwestern senator at that. So he wasn't the Harry Truman that we think back. We read the David McCullough biography and all the other things that help us understand and appreciate Truman. He was an unknown quantity, and the question on everyone's lips in Washington was, can he swing the job? And I think Eleanor was fond of him personally and kind to him. And I think he always had just a profound respect for her. He had redefined the role of First Lady in many ways. And I think he just respected her intellect and her writing and all that she brought to it. So,
I appreciate the anecdotes. She's always been a particular hero of mine, but I appreciate the anecdote after FDR has passed away and Truman has come and they are speaking, and he asked if there's anything that he can do for her, and she turns that around.
Yeah. She says, "You're the one in trouble now."
Yes.
And he knew, just how much trouble he was in. I mean, if you ever get a chance, you look at there's video footage, but there's also still photographs of Truman being sworn in. This is within about 2 hours of showing up at the White House after getting the news. I mean, he got the news at the White House once he showed up, but within 2 hours, the Chief Justice comes over and Truman's taking the oath of office on a Bible that was pulled from the head steward's desk because they didn't have time to get the Truman family Bible or anything that he would have wanted for that. But definitely deer in the headlights kind of look. I mean, when you look at Harry Truman in those early days of his presidency, he goes to Roosevelt's funeral, he comes back to Washington, he speaks to Congress, and his eyes are just always like, what do I do? What should I do? What should I say? Where am I? I mean, you can just tell that but he got, he somehow got a hold of it. I mean, he somehow hit the ground running. I think about all the changes he made in the executive branch and all the things that he implemented. He clearly had given that some thought. Yeah. And think about how quickly events unfold. I mean, you talk about May 2nd, Justice Jackson getting ready to go prosecute the war criminals. May 8th, Truman's birthday. Germany surrenders. Best birthday present he ever had, he said. And then, he's got Potsdam later in the summer, and the decision around the bomb, and the dropping of the bombs, and the surrender of Japan. And I mean, it's a lot to process. You think about on-the-job training. You've been in your post just a year. You think about all you've learned in a year, and all that you've done. I mean, can you imagine what he had to do in that first 4 months just to even keep the world going?
Yep.
It's really quite an incredible moment.
All right, so we do have a question. So from Helena, although neither Jackson nor Truman grew up in diverse environments, why do you think that they landed on the side of protecting civil rights?
That's a great question. And I suppose it is a bit of a mystery based on their backgrounds, but I go back to that core value that Truman cared about. I mean, in 1947, Truman was the first president ever to address the NAACP. He did so on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And he said, and this was in the aftermath of the blinding of Isaac Woodard. You know this story where the returning soldier, still in uniform, dragged from a bus, beaten by, well, in this case, South Carolina police so severely that he lost his sight permanently for the rest of his life. And so those things just bothered Truman. He just, enough is enough. And he said in that NAACP speech, he said, this has to stop, and we are going to extend the rights and privileges, the blessings of being an American. We are going to extend this to all Americans. And he said twice emphatically in that speech, and when I say all Americans, I mean all Americans. Mm-hmm. Now, to Helena, who asked the question, this is 1947. Okay, it's one thing for us to say that today and say, well, of course we're going to be fair. Of course we're going to treat all people equally. No, this was not the golden era of equality and equal treatment in America. Truman was 20 years ahead of the civil rights movement. There was no Martin Luther King. There was nothing yet. There were no sit-ins, no protests. There was nothing. Truman could have easily fallen back on his heritage. I mean, his family had been slaveholders. I mean, his mother refused to sleep in the Lincoln bedroom when she came to the White House. And when he got home from World War I, he comes to home and she says, take off that damn Yankee uniform in my house. That she didn't like a man in blue. She preferred a man in gray.
Gotcha.
So but Truman said, and maybe the best answer to your question is, he said toward the end of his life when he was interviewed about this, he said, you grow up in a place like Missouri, you just kind of have what's around you and you think the world is a certain way. And he said, it wasn't until I got in the army and got over to France that I realized the plight of African Americans, of the Black people in America. And he said, as president, I tried to do everything I could to help in that. But he said, and this is very telling, sometimes when I think about this subject, I wish I had done more. I regret that I didn't do more. And I think he was very sincere in that, I mean, and that's and I think, again, I go back to character. I mean, it's not because the prevailing biases of his time, of his state, of his family, of his nation could have easily given him cover he didn't even have to be a racist. He could have just laid low and just said, we'll just let this kind of work itself out as it goes through, which is typically how politicians like to see these things unfold. Truman said, no, the time to act is now. We cannot wait any longer. Great question.
Well, that sounds a little similar to Justice Jackson's dissent in Korematsu. So, very clearly laying out that these are U.S. citizens and you shouldn't be treating U.S. citizens differently based on their ethnic background in this particular instance. And, Justice Jackson had not really met many people of Asian descent at that point, but he grew up in this area in Jamestown, which has a very large Native American population. And so he used that as his frame of reference to help him understand how people who were not basically, European white men could be treated and the challenges with that. And that's part of what he used as his core to help him understand how this might be impacting people.
Yeah. No, great question. That's really, really interesting.
I'm going to ask you what's in your mug, since it is tea time.
It is a Yellowstone mug. I'm from Wyoming originally,
Yep.
so we gotta have that. So I like rooibos tea.
Nice. Yep.
It's African. It's not really a tea, I guess. It's an African root or whatever, the red root. And
Yep.
so every morning I make rooibos tea and I put goji berries in it, and they kind of rehydrate or whatever in the tea, and that is my beverage of preference to start the day.
That's nice. That's a little red bush and some red berries. You get your
That's right.
antioxidants in there at the same time.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, in light of our conversation today, I chose a tea from a shop called Churchill's Tea, because that
Very
seemed
good.
very World War II related to me. So that's what I went with.
Very appropriate.
All right, let me do one more quick scan and see if we have any other questions. And I am not seeing any. So Kurt, yeah, yes, yeah. Kurt, I know that the Truman Library is closed at the moment for renovations. Do you want to provide our audience with any update on what that looks like and
well,
how that's going?
For sure. Well, it's going very well. We're closed for COVID as well right now, but we are, the construction has been able to continue, fortunately, and we are looking at a fall date for the reopening. I don't know, we're not putting a month and a date on that exactly. The fall is a general time.
It's a lovely time.
It's a lovely time of the year, and it will be a wonderful time for a reopening. And we will have people, hopefully coming from all over by then. Hopefully we'll be past the pandemic and able to do that. Obviously, this all takes a back seat to people's health and wellness and whatnot around the country. And so we feel very fortunate that our project is still more or less on track. But, again, there's a lot of variables between now and then, but we have a wonderful new exhibit planned. It's a multi-million-dollar, renovation down to the bare walls of every direction. And it will be a complete new experience with a lot of new media pieces in it. And I mentioned at the beginning that one of the reasons our two institutions were together is because we have this Benedict bust of Robert Jackson that was a gift of the Wortmans. Well, when you come to see the newly reopened Truman Library, you will see a heroic-sized statue of Harry Truman striding out, also sculpted by Dexter Benedict and a gift of the Wortmans. So we're very grateful to their ongoing support in that way. It's a fabulous piece. It's already been cast. I've seen pictures of it not too far from you there in upstate New York, and really looking forward to having Don and Dexter and everybody out here to install that and have that be the first things visitors see as they come into our new museum. But it's going to be a stunning entrance, and just amazing video pieces, and just a really well designed exhibit. I mean, this is something that Harry Truman has been worthy of for some time, and I'm glad we're finally able to deliver on it.
That's wonderful. I enjoyed visiting there last fall, seeing his office there as it was laid out, and just imagining him in that space.
Yeah.
And really learning that he actually came to work there, that was a working office. It wasn't just some preservation. It was, right. This was his space.
Oh no, it's exactly how he left it. Yeah. Now his books weren't as nicely as arranged as yours, but nevertheless, he did have a lot of books. That's for sure.
Well, yeah, and I appreciate that about him as well. Yeah. Well, Kurt, thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate it. It's
been a real pleasure. I hope we can do this in person sometime.
I would like that very much. Yes,
yeah, we'll have a conversation here. We've got there'd be a great interest in this conversation, so we'll keep it going.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And for those of you who are tuning in next week we're going to be talking about the legacy of Nuremberg. So we're going to move forward into some of the tribunals that are going on today, and sort of do a forward-looking perspective of what did Nuremberg brought and where have we moved forward with it. So thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you for having tea with us, and I look forward to seeing you all next week.